What has your role been in the water crisis recovery so far, and what do you continue to do?
Well, Communities First is a local community development organization. We focus on 4 areas: affordable housing, economic development, and also we provide wraparound services for residents here in the city of Flint. Our role early on was to try to see what we could do to respond to the water crisis as fast as possible. So we end up working with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority in the state of Michigan to immediately get out bottles of water and thousands of water filters to affordable housing developments, not only just ours, but actually in the entire community of Flint. We did that over a 2-day period. So that was one particular thing that we worked on. Then we also work with the state to provide other services that might be needed for economic development for some small businesses, as far as some support there. And we worked on the providing more affordable housing opportunities for people, because we knew that lead was in people's homes. So we worked with the State Housing Development Authority to put projects of priority here in the city of Flint, and we're sitting in one of the developments today, which is Coolidge Park Apartments. That was a governor and state project that they funded to provide, lead-free housing, and I know that a couple other ones have been built, not ones that we've built, but we advocated for those particular developments here in the community, and they turned out to be wonderful projects that people can live in.
That's very cool. And you actually went to school here. When it was a school, what is it like to kind of see one of these projects come full circle?
Yeah, I mean, for me to go to this elementary, it has so many different personal touch points for me, but I remember sitting in this room as a kid playing a recorder on this floor, playing the little thing, trying to learn how to play something. And, we had little small class gatherings here to get together. And so it's definitely reminiscent of, many things, but I think it also shows that, even though things in the past, from being a abandoned school building to turn into something now that's being useful for the community and for families, I think that means more, to see that come full circle. Okay,
great. Sue, same question to you.
So I work for the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, and we're a local funder, and our vision is an equitable Genesee County where everyone has a chance to thrive. And the way we do that is by really connecting generosity, so donors who are interested in making the community better, with community needs. And we do that for good, forever, and for everyone. So we take a longer term goal and vision for helping after the water crisis. That's the role we played. We took in a number of funds, almost $40 million, 29 new funds, but I think the one that stands out the most is what we call the Flint Kids Fund. It was started by Dr. Mona. She challenged us, was the first donor to create the fund, and it's a $20 million fund. That's what we ended up bringing in, but really meant to meet the long-term needs of the children and families impacted by the water crisis. There are 4 strategies to that fund: education, early childhood and quality education, access to nutrition, family supports, and then helping access to medical homes to make sure our families had the connections they needed medically as they were responding to the water crisis. So the fund is still going. We have about $8 million to spend. But again, our role was really, working with our partners, but to really identify those long-term needs along those 4 strategies.
Okay, great. And Jamie, what about you? What has your organization's role been?
Yeah, so the United Way has been in our community. Actually, this year's our 100th year anniversary. And for really our entire history, we've been focused on trying to help basic needs of residents, helping lift families up, and really help create a community that's vibrant, right? And again, really try to help folks by raising money with small amounts. So, thousands of people giving a little bit each week, pooling those dollars, and then investing in basic needs for families that are struggling. In the water case, or the water crisis, really was unique for us in that for the first several months prior to the state's acknowledgement of the problems with the water, we really provided the daily emergency operations management. I know it sounds really unusual, but the situation obviously was very unusual. I was able to stand with Dr. Mona and a small group of folks from the Health Coalition when the data was released about the lead in the water that really galvanized the information that we were working with. And kind of from that day forward for about 3 months, every day we met, we prioritized, we raised funds, and we bought the first kind of large group of filters that were distributed in the community, those kinds of things. So that was kind of the acknowledgement of the water crisis at that level. And at the same time we were doing that, we were working with our friends at the Community Foundation and the Mott Foundation and the Ruth Mott Foundation and Congressman Kilday's office to try to figure out what would eventually become the Flint Kids Fund to invest longer term in the work. So you kind of have this pre-acknowledgement period of time, which was very stressful, right? Working 7 days a week, trying to immediately meet needs when you had kind of the government standoffish in terms of their willingness to address the problem. Then when the mayor declared the emergency, it changed the whole nature of the water crisis, right? And Mayor Weaver making that declaration then triggered the county and the state and the federal declarations regarding the water crisis. So once that was made, we worked as a partner with the state and the county and the city in the Emergency Operations Center on a daily basis. So we tried to do immediate needs issues. So for example, if folks remember, the Sheriff's Department started going door to door handing out water on one morning as soon as that declaration was made. I went to the truck rental place with the United Way credit card and rented all the trucks for the Sheriff's Department. We were paying to feed all the people initially that were coming in to volunteer and coordinating volunteers. So you have this phase where we're really working in partnership with that Emergency Operations Center. And then I would say where we are now, we're kind of in this recovery period where all the partners are trying to braid resources together to ensure that kind of the long-term needs of kids and residents are met. So, we're still maintaining a partnership with the Community Foundation and that group to work through, with the Flint Kids Fund. And I think all of us in the philanthropy space are trying to sort through what resources we have to most wisely invest them in this recovery period.
That leads into my next question. With United Way, especially, you guys were the boots on the ground initially, and then you're talking about how you guys were all working together. You're kind of in a recovery period now. What still needs to be done moving forward? I mean, we're several years into the recovery, but obviously the need is still there, and in a way, we don't even really understand all the long-term impacts. So from your perspective, what still needs to be done?
Yeah, so there are some real specific things that we need to continue to do, right? Ensure that children and families have a relationship with a primary care physician who understands the resources available to address those kids' needs, right? People need to stay connected because lead will express itself in folks' bodies over a long period of time. So we need to play the long game with making sure you have the medical side addressed. You also have an education piece that's very significant, where entities like the Flint Community Schools, but all the other school districts where these kids have landed in our intermediate school district are working together to ensure kids are screened and they can watch the developmental markers as they kind of move forward. So you've got kind of this health piece, you've got an education piece, but I think the piece that we need more than anything is a reestablishment of community trust, right? I think I can say pretty confidently that for the most part, most of the pipes have been changed, right? There's only a handful, I think another 1,000 or so that have to be changed. And we know our water system is incredibly highly monitored. We probably have the most monitored water system in the United States. So we know water in many cases is significantly better, but it doesn't matter how clean the water is if the families that live here don't trust that water is clean. So, even to this day, we're working with Nestle in partnership, and 3 semi-truckloads a week are coming into this city because we have a large portion of the population that still struggle to trust the water. So we're in this space where there are measurable things that need to be better, but there's also this sense of community trust, and that's going to take a lot longer time to really be able to address.
That's a very good point. Glenn, how do you think that community trust can be rebuilt?
I guess I would say that's a loaded question, right? Is how do you build community trust? And I think there's different layers to that. One is, I think, it's the integrity of the system, right? Do people actually trust what you're actually selling, what you're actually not just selling them, what you're actually telling them, right? So if I tell you the water is clean, right? People went through that before, right? They said that when they were saying, hey, our water was clean, our water was dirty. And they were even saying it like, Dr. Mona definitely brought light to it, but the individuals that were crying, for months and months and months, and some people, as early as a year, before that even happened, people were saying our water is dirty. There's something wrong. My dog wasn't even drinking the water at a period of time, right? He just didn't even drink. And I knew it was something wrong. I said, well, my dog's not drinking it, right? Before this, something's obviously have to be going on. So it's, do we actually trust it, right? If somebody says it. So I think it's one is who is relaying the information, right? That's the other thing, is making sure that you have a trusted party. Just because an individual says that it's clean doesn't mean that they're getting the information from the correct source. And then also bagging that up with data, right? Of, we've done testing over a period of time, and not just testing things, but actually randomly testing, right? Homes, and when I say randomly, I'm talking about homes that have had their pipes replaced, and randomly testing homes, not trying to make tests be done in a way that it just fits the system, right? But that is being done in an equitable way that people can say, hey, this is randomly, people are being selected. If the water is clean, great. So I think that's one way. That's the second way. And then I think the third way is just continually letting people know the importance of actually replacing the pipes, right? And because I think Jamie mentioned that a little bit earlier, but there are still people that don't want individuals to come in their homes to replace their pipes and to get the necessary services that's needed. So how information is being disseminated, and to make sure that you're going knocking on those people's doors and really having a deep conversation with them about trying to make sure that they're getting the resources that they need to be successful.
Okay, great. I digressed a little bit because that was such an interesting, thing that you brought up. So I want to get back to your organizations, of course. When it comes to funding, is money still available to you, and how much is left? Glenn, I'll start with you.
Right. Well, for us, with the affordable housing piece that we were working with the state agencies, that was a one-time thing that they allocated funding to the city of Flint. We have requested at different times, hey, can that be brought back? Can we build some more more quality affordable housing that we know that could be, lead-free, new, clean, accessible, affordable housing. So yes, there is funding there. However, it's not allocated to the city of Flint. The second part of that, we work with partners just like the Community Foundation and United Way and Mott Foundation and other ones about going to them and saying, hey, are resources available to be able to solve certain problems that we're dealing with in the community, with the masses, right? And if they don't have the resources that they need, right, it's very hard for them to get the resources out. I think what has happened even in our road to recovery is that people were still giving, and then you have this compounded of COVID, right, that impacts everyone, and then the funding that the organization probably should still be having to help get through this road to recovery. Those things compounded, really didn't help the situation as far as with fundraising for the recovery, because there's still some things that have to be done, like for mental health. I think that's another thing when it came back to your other question about trust. And about funding, is like there needs to make sure there's additional resources for mental health, because imagine the trauma, right? And that's one thing that we've been dealing with a lot, that we have been seeking additional funding for, is to help deal with certain things when it comes to people dealing with trauma, because you had the water, now you have COVID on top of that. That's a lot of trauma for a community that's already been through so much.
So I saw you nod your head a lot when he brought that up. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, first of all, we have a grant conversation right after this. Glenn and I are talking about some grants and projects he wants to get done, so I'm looking forward to that kind of. So yeah, we are in it for the long haul, and the specific fund that we created, the Flint Kids Fund, it was really a 20-year fund. The idea being that it would last throughout the time where we actually got a sense of how children and families were impacted. So we did have that in mind, and we have about half of the fund. Jamie's on the committee, which is very helpful. We have a small group of committee members who help guide us, including Dr. Mona. And they're very thoughtful. They're very aware of the gaps and the needs. And so the idea is to make it last that 20 years. And the generosity that we saw for that fund alone was incredible. We had children who were passing up their birthdays and giving their birthday money to the fund. We had prisoners who gave their work money and sent it into the fund. You know, women who send in still $5 a month, right? So it's incredible generosity that came to Flint, and we feel the onus is on us to make sure that we are spending it well with the guidance of our committee members. I would also say I also wanted to respond to the trust. For us, it's really making sure that we are listening to the community, lifting their voices. You heard, they weren't heard. And for us to be good grant makers and to make sure we are meeting community need, that's important. And then for the long-term recovery of the community, there's a lot to be done. If you think about the layers of trauma, I would love for every family not, to have multiple childhood adverse, effect that's affecting them, whether it's racism and poverty. There are so many challenges out there for our families. And then I would say that we did learn a lot about crisis fundraising, if that makes sense. There was a certain window. We had a much bigger number in mind for the Flint Kids Fund. In fact, I thought we were, thinking $150 million. It was new for us. We didn't know crisis grant making. We are happy with where we ended, and we're going to spend the money well, but there's still always a need, as you can imagine, for Flint families. And then ironically, today is a year anniversary of when we established the relief fund for COVID that we now are managing. And I will say that we learned a lot from the water crisis that has helped us to manage that fund. We are now, I think, crisis maybe grant makers, I'm not sure. But we've learned a lot. I think our community is well positioned with funding, and then there's some infrastructure. I wanted to make sure we mentioned the Flint Registry. That is how our families can get signed up and connected. So I think we're well positioned, but there's still a lot to do, but we have great partners to do it.
How much is left in the Flint Kids Fund?
We have about half. We're closing in on about $8 million. So we have some budgeting to do to make sure we last the 20 years, and we want to be very thoughtful and strategic about where the gaps and needs are and not replacing public money. At the same point, I would say we still have an opportunity to raise dollars for it as well. So hoping we can continue to raise more money. There's a lot of competing priorities, especially with COVID, but with what we learned and how we can align our money and our partnerships, I think we'll be able to get there.
Great. Jamie, when it comes to funding, is the money still available, and how much do you guys have left?
Yeah, so over the course of the water crisis, and I want to be clear, the United Way made a commitment not to take any administrative costs regarding these dollars. So by not taking administrative costs, we were able to invest probably another $650,000 in direct services because we didn't take any of that money to operate ourselves. And that's a really important part for us, because we felt at the very beginning we had to take a moral stand with the water crisis and make sure all the money we raised directly went to programs and services for kids and families. So that was important. In the neighborhood of the dollars we raised a total of about $8 million. About $3 million of that was from a very specific relationship with General Motors, quite frankly, and the UAW. The remaining dollars were from all parts of the world, just like the Community Foundation experienced. We had from school kids and classrooms to actually inmates in jails to folks from around the world that contributed to that fund. And then those dollars were released directly to grantees, more than 100 different grantees across our community. So today, regarding that particular fund, we probably have about $13,000 left. Very, very little, because as the dollars come in, we spend those dollars. So currently today, we're funding, the 3 help centers that exist, and kind of blending that with money we have from COVID too, and working together.
That's right.
So as the money is coming in, and we've been directly pushing it out. It's also worth noting that Nestle has donated almost $3 million worth of water over the last 3 years. As those trucks continue to come in every week, that's about $1 million a year worth of water. That's been a really significant in-kind donation to our community as we kind of move forward. I think what's kind of been talked about is COVID has kind of now superseded everything related to the water crisis. So where we were maybe raising $100,000 to $200,000 a year, 5 and 6 years out from the initial water switch, that's all almost gone away. Because folks now are focused on their own communities, as they should be, as we recover from the pandemic. And I think realistically, as we look at what resources will continue to come in around the Flint water crisis, those are now going to be the lawsuit settlement and how that impacts individual families. Those will be some government programs that maybe we're able to tap into that overlap between COVID and the water crisis kind of needs. Those are kind of the longer term sources that we're going to have because COVID has taken so much energy out of the space. I did want to comment on a couple things related to what they said that were really important and that I'm sure they'll comment about. All of us here lived in Flint during a significant portion of the water crisis. Although we might not be there now, we were all deeply affected by this. I have a 12-year-old, and we got up in the morning and we used bottled water to brush our teeth. Our kids went to child care services in the city of Flint. They took showers and lived in our houses. My house in particular at the time that I lived in was a test site for the lead. I became one of those houses that tested every so many months to help the city keep track and the federal government keep track of what the trends were across the city with regard to lead in your water. So all of us have these long-term scars because this community is our community as well. And I think we can never underestimate this trust issue and the personal nature of how every individual resident has experienced this very differently. If you had a child, if you had a grandparent, if you were losing your hair, if like all those kind of things make this so deeply personal. The other issue I wanted to mention, because I really think it's worth it in establishing the trust, is, Flint now has its own independent testing lab. That's based on the north end of Flint, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. The fascinating thing is, so we have a lab in Flint, run by Flint residents, overseen by a professional, a chemist to help us understand. And Flint residents can now test their own water with an independent source. And I think even if we tell folks the water's clean over and over again and the government says it, I think having an independent opportunity to test your own water is another step toward trust, right? Because I think when the solutions are overseen and managed by Flint residents are going to have a higher degree of trust in those results. It's still an uphill battle, but I think it's really worth noting that this independent testing in a high quality way is one of the other pathways to reestablishing the trust piece.
Absolutely. I did not know that. That's very cool.
Yeah, and he got me thinking about trust a little bit. And I think, and I'm not trying to, compound too many more things on top of this, but like when you think about everything that's happening right now with trust, right? A lot of people are like paying attention to like the lawsuits and the criminal charges and all those things that are happening, right? And seeing how those are being dealt with. And I think is how those are dealt with is going to help people establish trust back in the governmental system, because if certain things are not being held accountable, or if people are not being held accountable, or like how can you ever pay back someone that lost a child in a lawsuit and say, you're only going to get $20,000? I mean, I don't know what that number is. I'm just throwing out an example, but the trauma that, I still live in the city of Flint, but the trauma that me, my wife, having a child and experienced here in the city of, and I have to still get up and fight, right? And still have to get up and be an encourager and then try to make sure that people are getting the resources, we all do, make sure people are getting the resources that they need to make sure that they're safe or feeling comfortable. But I think in the back of all of our heads is, okay, we really want to move this forward. Who's going to be held accountable? And are we really going to get the restitution, right? As a community. And when I say restitution, that doesn't always have to just be when it comes to the stroke of the check, but the restitution is holding people accountable, doing what the government says they're going to do, and then also not trying to sweep it under the rug like, oh, this is just something that happened in Flint, right? This is something that happened to a community of people that did not know, some people didn't know that this was happening, and people were being poisoned. So imagine right now, you have COVID and you have to wash your hands, or you have to be real clean, and you have people that have to stay indoors, and you have people that don't even trust their water. And so you think about those things. I mean, could you imagine thinking about that on a daily basis? You see what I'm saying? I can get poisoned leaving my house, or I can be poisoned in my home.
Danger inside,
Danger outside, right? So could you imagine, some people don't even feel safe in their own homes, right? So it's until we as a community or as a government, until we're able to feel like we've been given restitution in a correct way that's equitable, that's true, I think that's the only place you're really going to see some reconciliation happen within our community. And that's just a start.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer for sure. Sue, I'll start with you on this one. Several years into the recovery, what are the needs now? Have they changed at all since the beginning?
Yeah, it's a tough question, right? Because it's really hard to pinpoint the true effects of the water crisis, especially on children and families. And then we had started thinking about it as a cohort approach. So thinking about those children who were 0 to 5 at the time, because they were probably the most impacted at that developmental level, where they could have been impacted cognitively with the effects of lead. Since then, though, we've I think, changed and shifted. So as a committee, we're thinking about it more broadly, because we know the trauma that could impact the family beyond just that 0 to 5. We've shifted our strategy and kind of removed that age bracket, and that we're not just limiting it to that. So we're still looking at then more broadly, how do we serve the families? So even one of the supports is one of the strategies is family supports. And so and I think it still rings true, as you heard Glenn say, day to day, just getting through day to day is still a challenge for most families. And so I think broadening it that way and considering all of the dynamics and effects that families are dealing with, again, with COVID on top of it, is really where we've broadened and we're trying to listen to the residents about their needs. I think the challenging piece was always trying to gauge where public dollars were going to come and where they weren't. What gaps were they going to fill and not, right? Because we don't want to replace the public dollars, but it was really kind of almost a chicken and egg game. Like we couldn't wait for them to get started. I think the other interesting factor that happened a lot is where philanthropic dollars and our local partners were able to use money wisely and innovate. And now we've created models that throughout the United States they're looking at. Some of our early ed work, looking at the EduCare model in the new building and thinking about all day, all year round early childhood and how we're funding it is now changing how Lansing is possibly going to fund early ed moving forward. So we've not only, the silver lining being that we had to partner in new ways, we had to work together and use resources in different ways, but we created some new ways of doing business as well that I think will pay off in the long run.
Very interesting. Jamie, how have the needs changed over?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we haven't talked about that's absolutely critical is advocacy for change at the state and federal level around a couple different issues. I mean, not only did we have a lead and water crisis, we had a cost crisis. Water in Flint was more expensive than water in the middle of the desert, right? Las Vegas water,
yes,
cheaper than Flint water. That makes no sense, right? So we've got to acknowledge water and access to water really as a right, as a public health requirement, and then we need to bring the cost of water into a space that allows people to contribute some to the cost of it, but doesn't penalize poor people, essentially, with really high water rates, right? So how can we create an equitable water rate structure in Michigan? And there are laws that need to be changed to allow those new ways of doing things to happen, right? Because not unlike Flint, Detroit has a water rate problem. And when we turn off the water, it does a couple things. We then have health outbreak related issues, right? And our water systems that are under the ground then don't work properly because the systems themselves are not flushing enough water through the system, and then they don't work right. Then we have bacteria and all these other problems. So we have to be really strong in the advocacy side because, for example, all of us together with the philanthropic dollars, we couldn't pay off all the water bills in the city of Flint. It's $20 or $30 million worth of past due water bills. So the answer can't be that philanthropy steps in and just pays for everybody to have the water bill. The solution is in policy change at the state level and the federal level to make water affordable for folks, right? And affordable for folks not just in Flint, but in rural areas where water infrastructure is poor, and folks in those places are drinking bad water, right? So we got to move past the dollars that are sort of raised like we've done from charitable purposes and more into this advocacy space around these issues to ensure that the institutions themselves are equitable, not biased, not really penalizing the poor, quite frankly, because the costs of that far exceed the costs of doing it the right way, right? When thousands of people have to use hospitals and doctors in ways that they wouldn't otherwise have to if they have clean, regular water to maintain a sanitary, healthy condition, it costs more for us to treat people on the back end than it would to just do it right in the first place.
Go ahead. I was just going to, so I think looking at it from a systems perspective and systems change is exactly right. And it's going to take that advocacy because we need to shift how things are working. And I'll sound like a broken record, but I also think we need to be very diligent. But we have the Flint Registry should give us a sense of where the gaps are. There's also the Flint Kids Report Card from the Genesee County Health Coalition, which is going to guide us and show us hopefully where the gaps are. But I think the onus is on us to make sure we're being diligent about seeing how the effects are showing up differently than we might not have anticipated.
And then making sure, like you're talking about, that all the data points are being collected, in a good way, because, like you're saying, making sure the voices of people are being lifted, not just people that are just writing reports or doing surveys, because sometimes there's a disconnect between the individual that could be writing the reports or doing the surveys, the way in which the questions are asked. So to make sure that the whole process is done in an equitable way, that people can actually receive the information, right, that is being done with compassion and not pity, right? How do you, get the community to a place of understanding that organizations are reaching out with the hand of compassion? And sometimes, that's not what's felt, right? And it's making sure that those things are being addressed. Another thing is one thing that even happens in the road of recovery that I would say I experienced in certain aspects, and this is nothing towards like Sue or Jamie or anything like that, but when you did have certain resources that were coming to the community, right, that you had organizations that were led by people of color, that's on the ground, that's here working, that's going out in the community, and when the resources came in, they didn't go to organizations with people that look like me, right? People weren't writing the $100,000 checks or the $200,000 checks to the organizations led of color. They were writing it to either organizations that were comfortable or people that look like them, right? And so you still have a negative taste, right, with some of the biases of how certain resources went out into the community that didn't go to certain organizations, right, that felt like that maybe they should have got it and they didn't get it. And so they might have been there doing certain work on the ground and people weren't recognizing it as actually being work, right? It's it's just to ensure that resources are being spread in an equitable way. And I think, Sue did a great job of explaining that when she was talking about the community foundation from the beginning, but how do you get the resources out in an equitable way to lift the voices of people that's actually there? Like, just because it's also not taking the aspect of what we feel is right, like that's why our name is Communities First, is not what Communities First feels is right, but the reason why we have the name of Communities First is what does the community feel is right, and what should we be doing? So if people have been crying to us and saying, we need more additional housing, we need more additional housing resources, or we need certain wraparound services, or we need mental health, or we need these services, how can we get those things to them? And I think that's where we're all talking about right now, is how do we respond? Right, is more or less having an adaptive leadership mentality that we talk about within our organization all the time, is being adaptive to what's happening rather than us, saying, well, this is what we do. so this is what we stick with. And I think that's the thing, that the road to recovery, that everybody's going to have to go down that line of being adaptive. Is, okay, this was working 6 months ago, this has shifted, how can we get here now? Because this is what we have to do in order to build the trust.
Especially in a situation where we don't even know the long-term impact.
Exactly, right. And Sue spoke to that great when she was just saying that, you know, you don't know, you know, what's going to happen 5 years from now. And if you're not being adaptive and you're just being more reactive, right? And it's being proactive and adaptive at the same time. It's an interesting
Balancing act.
It was. Yeah.
right.
Have you accomplished what you hoped to? What would help you accomplish it? Let's see, has anyone not been first yet? Sue, have you been first? I think you. Okay, you go for it.
Yeah, I'll give it a try. And it builds on some of our other questions. Gosh, no, I mean, I'm proud of what we've been able to do. We've tried to do it as equitably as possible and lifting our resident voice. I'm sure in a crisis situation where you're trying to get money out the door quickly to address the issue while balancing the long terms, it's probably the most challenging place I've been as a grant maker ever. I mean, you have to be comfortable without knowing and trying to do your best at the time. So I'm proud of what we've done, but I think there's a lot more to do. And I think the structure of a community foundation is something I've learned to appreciate even more, because it's always going to be there for the long-term goal of long-term well-being of a community. But I think one of the greatest needs actually that has come out of all of this is this recognition that we need equity, right? And I think we're doubling down on that now. I think we learned from the water crisis. I don't know that the appetite to have that conversation, which can be uncomfortable, was there, right? I don't know that it was, but with the water crisis happening, I think we know we have to do it different so that we don't have another water crisis. Would that have happened it happened in a Black and brown community, and would it have happened anywhere else? Probably not. That's the reality. So what can we do in having those honest conversations now to change how we are all working together and differently to make sure of equitable access to services? And so we've doubled down. We have some grant funding that we're working on around truth, racial healing, and transformation. I know we've been working with Jamie on, just making sure that we're approaching this, having conversations in the community, having some visioning sessions, but talking about how do we work differently moving forward to make sure that our community gets what it deserves and again, equitably.
Jamie, have you accomplished what you hoped to, and if not, what would you need to accomplish it?
Sure. I mean, I think certainly we're proud of the work that we've been able to do, but I would say we certainly feel like there's this huge gap between what we can do in philanthropy and what really needs to happen to bring equity to our community, right? And I think that part of the challenge is we have to look back in an honest way, and we have to say, the Flint Water Crisis was much more than a mistake or a flipping a switch to change to the Flint water, right? How did we get there? We got there from decades of not investing in a city and the infrastructure in a way we as a state should have invested more equitably, right? We got there because the way we structure our housing in the community is not necessarily equitable for people of color, right? And then we got there because there was an emergency manager law that, quite frankly, was applied in a way that was not to the benefit of an equitable approach, right? I mean, and then the decision was made to sort of flip the switch to create the problem. So we've got a long history that if we can't come to grips with even discussing it, it's kind of hard to get to the solution that we want, where we do have an equitable application of resources of our institutions to bring opportunity for everybody in a way. Because I think this is a really important, there's a difference between equality and equity, right? Because everybody's starting at a different place. And if we say, everybody gets this no matter what, Well, if we're starting up here, we're already advantaged so much. So we have to find a way to decouple the word equality with equity and address it in a meaningful way. And I don't think we're going to get to where we need to get unless we can be honest with how we got here. And I do think the COVID crisis has opened up different levels of conversations that weren't able to happen before the water crisis. Now, I think here in Flint, the water crisis, we funded a lot of African-American led churches, quite frankly, in ways we had never imagined that as a United Way we would be funding. And that built relationships with so many more people than we had known before. You know, we didn't really understand the community in the same way until the water crisis really happened, and we were all sort of in that boat, I would say, just together, right? So I think we really have to learn lessons from that. If we don't, just like everything, we'll repeat, you know, sort of this cycle. But I do think we have a unique opportunity now to maybe break that cycle around the equity conversation. I've never seen a time when almost every meeting we go into, equity is discussed as a part of the overall framework, right? Prior to COVID, that happened around maybe diversity conversations, or maybe it happened once over a period of meetings. But I do think now the meetings and communication are different because at the government level, at least in the state, at our local level, I think equity, that word and that concept are entered into the conversation in really almost every conversation we have. So that's a change, right? And that's a good change. And that will hopefully help us take another step forward.
It's very interesting when you bring up the parallels between the water crisis and COVID, and Flint may have been experiencing just you rip off the Band-Aid and there it is, like the inequity of it all with the Flint water crisis, and kind of now the whole country is experiencing that with COVID, but Flint kind of did it first.
It's something you couldn't even help, right? And so, I mean, think about being, not helpless, but what is that? I guess, yeah, you can't help yourself, right? So think about COVID, like, oh, I can't protect my family. That's the same feeling that everyone had when it came to water. It's like, okay, I got to turn off the water in my house, or I can't use it, right? But could you imagine that thought process that someone would go through? Of, wow, my family was drinking, taking showers in this, brushing their teeth. How are my kids going to be impacted over the next, 5, 10, 15 years? Did something happen to them? And then if something did happen, right, it's, that's a compounded, and then the COVID.
How are we going to figure it out?
Right. And then COVID happened, and, like you say, you rip the Band-Aid off, and then now it's like when it rains, it pours,
Yeah, all of this is exposed.
And trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
And now, your turn to answer that
Okay.
question. Have you accomplished what you hoped to, and what would help you accomplish?
Yeah, I would say no. We have not accomplished everything we wanted to accomplish. Right now in the city of Flint, we have a need for about 15,000 additional affordable housing units in our community. People say that there is a abundance of housing in the community, but when you really go and you pay attention in our community, what we have a lot of older homes that weren't maintained, that are poor quality. We have some landlords that do own certain, apartment complexes that don't take care of them. We have a lot of things that are being condemned because of bad management. It also speaks to Jamie's point about us having very high water bills. It's very hard also on the landlord side, right, to pay very high water bills. The one thing for us as an organization, as far as a nonprofit, is, our profit margins don't have to be as much as a for-profit developer. So we're going to pay our water bills, right? But the water bills are definitely a heavy lift, right? For something like this. This is 60 unit apartment complex, and you have the highest water bills in the country. But no, until we're able to really start moving the needle in a larger way to be able to make sure that people, because we talk about equity. How can I get mental health if I don't feel like I'm in a safe, decent, affordable place to live in, right? That's the start of your very basic level need of helping you to get to a road of recovery, to come out of trauma, right? To help you with financial wealth building. For any services that you need, we have worked with a lot of our residents where we've seen them where, they were on the street and they were homeless. We get them here, and then not just at this particular development, but any development, we get them the wraparound services that they may need, right? And then you start realizing that sometimes people need to decompress from trauma over like a whole entire year of working with getting certain services. And then they're actually ready to start really moving on to getting into employment and other things of that nature. So the other thing about us is not the recovery and the speed in which we think, because I think that's the other thing that sometimes people get mixed up. Is like, you should be over that by now, move on. Everybody deals with trauma differently. Everybody responds differently. And until we're able to get every last person off the street, which I believe for a homeless perspective, I think we have about a little over 1,000 people that are homeless in the city of Flint, or somewhere around that number. We can solve that problem, right? So if we have additional resources to do that, but then you're not worrying about people going to shelters as much, right? If you got people housed, now you're focusing on recovery of the individual. You're focusing on helping them deal with their trauma, getting them the job opportunities they need. But now I don't have to worry about where they live. You see what I'm saying? So no, we have not solved all the problems, but we have made progress, right? So I don't want to think we haven't made progress, but there is so much farther to go.
Something Jamie brought up about changes that need to be made in the structure of things and in Lansing and with water systems. But immediately what I thought is the drive for that change there in Lansing? Is it there in other places beside Flint? Because there was a time a couple years ago when Flint Water Crisis was on CNN, it was on NBC News, and now it's just not. So do you guys think that the drive for that change is still there at the level it needs to be?
So I think there is an appetite to change how our institutions function around water, right? Because the pipes under the ground in Flint, not unlike the pipes underground in a lot of places, both urban and rural. And the cost of water across the United States is increasing, pretty significantly. And I mean, there's a water crisis that happened in Texas after the storm. There's a water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi right now, yeah. And they haven't been able to drink their water for 3 or 4 weeks, and they don't have an end date as to when they can. There's been a water crisis after Flint where all the schools across the country that were old were finally getting tested, and they're finding, significant contamination. So I think there's an appetite for affordable water and systems that can help, really, quite frankly, in both urban and rural areas. I think what's preventing common sense work is partisanship and gamesmanship around all the other issues, as opposed to just focusing on like an issue and fixing it. Issues become entangled with all the other different things that people want, and then we can't get work done. So I do think the current administration in Lansing is certainly very much open to change, but that change can't happen with the governor alone. That has to happen through a bipartisan effort of the legislature, right? And I think somehow, we've got to find more common ground, and we've got to make the arguments about why this is good, not just for Flint, but why it's good for, poor northern Michigan areas where poverty is high.
Yeah. Sue, would you care to weigh in?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think you can change systems and or policy top down and bottom up. I think we have to look at both, right? We have to work at both the national, the state, and the local level. I do think we can be deliberate as funders, or maybe even, in our space, to make sure that we are including citizens. I think it's going to take a deliberate movement of getting the data, research around what does it take to, lower water prices. What have other industrialized cities done in these cases? And then I would highlight our example of EduCare, which is our early ed model, really includes parent engagement. And the idea is not just, we don't want just parents showing up. We want them to be part of the solution and to share their voices in Lansing. So we actually have a parent ambassadors group where we work with them. They are the ones who go to Lansing, talk to the legislature, and tell them what the needs are for their students. And that's the parents, and that's powerful. So I think it will take some deliberate, maybe shift in thinking and some deliberate investments, but it can definitely be bottom up, and that's actually what my favorite part is. But we have some good models, again, that have come up since the water crisis that I think we can really tap into and keep moving forward.
Glenn?
And so I agree with all the points that they made. It also makes you think about collectivism rather than individualism. And I think that's where a lot of these problems happen, is that, like to say, oh, don't let a crisis go to waste, right? And then people start thinking about individually, how you can solve a problem that doesn't impact people as a whole, right? So just to give you a quick example, like even when we were just talking about the housing aspect, we didn't go to the governor and say, hey, give communities first 4 projects. We said, we tried to go for 10, it came back at 4, but we tried to advocate as long as the housing gets built, you see what I'm saying, and it gets built in an equitable way, then that's great. You see what I'm saying? And it's, sometimes what happens is like the individualism piece begins to creep in is how does either an individual person, and how does individual person benefit, right, from this, instead of saying how do we collectively, like when Jamie mentioned, like, as the state as a whole, right, is like here, one of the problems is everybody doesn't have access to fresh and healthy foods, right? So, you need grocery stores. Everybody doesn't have access to quality health care. Everyone doesn't, and when I say access, like it can be accessible, right? It can be available. A lot of things are available, but when you start really talking about like equitable access, it's not there, right? It's a totally big, yes, we have grocery stores, they are available, but they're not in places that are accessible to people that need them most, right? And it's us thinking about that collectively, as far as like, if you're looking in other cities, if that's a problem that's collectively impacting urban communities, how do we solve that problem, right? Because we all have the problem. Poverty, between Flint and Detroit, I think, Flint is at a 40% poverty rate, and I think Detroit is right at like a 30%. We're like in the top 10, for poverty rate. So when you start thinking about those numbers, how do we solve that collectively, because these are the problems that we have, right? Not thinking about it on an individual level, because racism is still the same no matter where you go. Segregation is still the same no matter where you go, right? And I think if we start thinking of those problems that way, then we can start coming to a collective of, we just need to solve this problem, right?
I would add, the most frustrating thing in the world is we can land a rocket, on Mars, and you're telling me we can't figure out how to manage a municipal water system? I think this is a great dilemma that we have. It really is not about the can we do it. It's about allocating the resources, the time, effort, energy in a way, and then making those investments, quite frankly, in ourselves, so that we can launch more rockets to Mars. The reality is, if we had the water system fixed and we have a healthier population and we were doing better in school as a nation, we're going to have more of the rocket ships landing, right? And I think, again, we can do so many amazing things, and it's endlessly frustrating that we can't just fix this and rebuild that trust. And so I'm optimistic that we can fix the problem. For me, it's more of the will together to do it and building a coalition of folks, to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for your input. I feel like we've covered such a good range of topics, but I want to give you each, a few minutes. If there was anything I didn't ask you, anything you want our viewers to know about the work that you guys, that your organizations have done, about what's needed as we move forward in recovery from this crisis, anything at all. I want to give you each a little bit of time. So whoever wants to start.
I guess I'm at the end, the camera's down here.
Okay.
I think we need to commit ourselves to honestly understanding what got us here in a genuine, real, way, right? And acknowledging those things will give us a base to move forward. But if we're not willing to understand what got us here, we'll probably repeat those problems moving forward. So that real open, honest approach and conversation and some reconciliation, quite frankly, around the institutional biases that have happened will give us, I think, that strength to kind of push forward and kind of look forward optimistically. The other thing I would add is I think the world can learn from Flint in terms of how we're all trying to work together, despite the many differences that we all have even within our own community. I think there's been a real earnest effort to work together we all have dignity. We all need to be treated with respect, and we all need to strive toward equity in that space. And I'm hopeful that some of the things that we did here in Flint, folks will learn from maybe more broadly. And I hope that people have a realistic view of who we are in Flint too. There's amazing things in our community. We're not just the story of a water crisis, right? We're the story of world-class folks, right? And not, we have world-class athletes for sure, right? We have tons of those, but we also have world-class human beings that do all sorts of things. And I think we have to lift that part of our Flint story because there is a greatness here. There is a long history here where we've excelled in ways that I think can inspire others.
And I would say, for me, just a thank you to all of our donors for their generosity during the time, for all of our committee volunteers, for all of our grantees, and then for all the residents who have all fed into how we were making grants out of the Flint Kids Fund and told us, maybe you're not meeting, doing the right thing or not. So just a thank you to all who were involved, and to know that, we as the Community Foundation will continue. We still have dollars left, right? We have a longer term view, and we intend to spend them wisely and with input from all the folks I just mentioned. But similar to what Jamie said, don't count Flint out. We have we learned a lot, and I think created some new ways of doing business, as I mentioned. And I think we can only just keep continuing to do that and building it to scale, but it's gonna take some deliberate efforts, some investment, some different conversations, real honest conversations about equity, and continuing to move that forward in order to continue those systems changes. There's a lot of work to do here. But again, don't count Flint out. We just finished our census campaign, and with all the distrust and all the water crisis, we're cautiously optimistic that we are going to end up with a higher count than we did in the past. And so Flint stood up and was counted. And I think they will only continue to do so, and I look forward to continuing the work with our partners and with the community.
Glenn?
You'll cut that piece out.
It made you speechless.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about what y'all said. If there's anything I wanted to add, it's just that I think that the focus needs to remain on people. It's not about individual problems that people have with each other. I think what I think Flint has started experiencing a little bit more, even through the water crisis and through COVID, is that you have to start putting your grudges aside when it comes to the progress of people, because sometimes grudges and feelings about certain things is really what hampers progress. And if you really focus on, or if we all focus on just helping people, I think that will help us get to a point. It doesn't matter how the help is getting done. It's like I love Sue, but if I didn't like Sue, but Sue was doing something great and it was getting done and it was being done the right way, then I need to help Sue, because Sue is for the ultimate goal of trying to help our collective community. If Jamie is doing something and he's doing it great, if me and Jamie, if we don't see eye to eye, it does not really matter. If he's doing something great, I need to support Jamie to make sure he's able to get it done, whatever it is that he needs to get done. And I think that's what we're starting to experience through this racial inequity thing when it comes to our community, is that people are realizing that I really don't even know why you might not even know why you have problems with certain people. It could be the power dynamics or power structures or racism and those different things. But when you start realizing when you put people as the focus, you see what I'm saying? Like it really gets rid of all the crap, right? It gets rid of all of it. And I think that as an organization, as community partners, is that if we all continue to keep our communities first, keep people first, and understanding that we're here to serve, not to be served, and have a servant's leadership heart, is what can we do to leave the room with the best idea and not my idea. I think that's what's going to get us to a place of true reconciliation and true recovery.